Welcome to our September webinar. We are going to be talking today about how to get a job in climate tech. And we have 3 panelists joining us today. I'm going to let all of you introduce yourselves in a second here. And then just as people continue to trickle in, a few reminders. The webinar will be recorded, so you all will be able to watch this back. And for anyone who doesn't make it, that is an option as well. And then we do have a Q&A chat going, so please feel free to add your questions there. If you have any as they come up, we'll try to get to all of them and then save some time at the end for some additional questions as well. But it looks like, here we go. Why don't we get started? Jamie, Anne, and Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. I am so thrilled that you can be here with us. This is a webinar that our audience has been asking for a little while now, and so it's very exciting to have all of you with us. I'd love for us to start with introductions. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and maybe the career trajectory that led you here. Anne, why don't we start with you?
Okay, hi, I'm Anne Downing, and I have been recruiting for over 20 years, and the past 8.5 years specifically in the renewable energy climate space. I worked in-house at 2 different companies in the Bay Area, and then have consulted with several startups and small companies functioning as their in-house recruiter when they are building their teams and do not yet have an in-house recruiter. And recently, over this past year, I've joined Climatebase to launch recruiting as a service, where we have a recruiting service where we help companies that advertise on Climatebase if they need recruiting help. So super excited to be here today and talk to you all about getting positions in the climate space.
Awesome. Jamie.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Maria. It's very exciting to be here. My name is Jamie Durfee. Just a little background on myself. So I graduated from CU Boulder in 2009, and I currently reside in Santa Fe, which is my hometown. I moved back to get into hospitality management. I spent several years managing restaurants here until 2017, at which point I joined a tech startup called Descartes Labs here in Santa Fe. It's a geospatial company that spun out of one of our national labs. So I started as a recruiting coordinator. It was really wonderful. I was responsible for building out the recruiting coordinating function and specifically recruiting candidates to New Mexico. But I quickly moved into full-time recruiting. I initially was focused on general and administrative roles, but quickly moved into technical. And yeah, as I moved through my early recruiting career, I really wanted a greater focus on sustainability and to be a part of a company that was making more of an impact in regard to mitigating climate change. So last May, I joined Pachama, which is a lovely company. I am their sole in-house recruiter, working on all roles and employee belonging initiatives. And some of my main focuses today alongside recruiting are diversifying our workforce and, of course, which kind of ties into what we're talking about today, but helping to support others in their search to join climate tech. So very excited to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, Jennifer, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. And thanks so much, Maria. My name is Jennifer Applebaum. I'm the Managing Director of Workforce Development at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and that's a quasi-governmental agency. So it's a little bit of a different perspective. I spend a lot of time working directly with clean energy and climate tech companies as part of our portfolio, which really spans a lot of different programs and grant funding across everything from early career awareness to training for new entrant employees, upskilling, and even supporting some small businesses in the climate tech space as they grow. My background's been a bit of a windy path. I actually started out in the HIV prevention sphere and then spent some time as a public school teacher, both in New York City and in Oakland, and then have spent the last decade plus doing workforce development at the state level. So I'm excited to be here today and see if we can share some of what we're hearing from employer partners as they try and figure out the way to scale forward, because everybody has so much of a need to do that strategically in this moment. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. So why don't we start maybe with a little bit of a bird's eye view of the industry? We'd love to hear about maybe some trends that you have seen over the past few years. How have things changed? What are some of the biggest trends in the space at the moment? And maybe we can follow that same sequence of you all.
Okay, great. So what I've seen over the past 5 years is there's obviously been a lot of new companies building, starting seed through Series C now, in all over the country. I'm not going to say it was just in the Bay Area in New York, but go back 5 years ago, if you were in the Midwest, you probably didn't even have a chance of working in the climate space locally. And now there's companies popping up all over the place, which is really great to see because people all across the country, I think, are really understanding the impact that it makes. And I'm also seeing that there are a lot of companies are opening up their candidate pool to candidates that don't have climate experience. Whereas before it was so niche and companies thought they could only hire people that have climate experience. Well, there's only so many people that have that. So they're really opening up who they're interviewing and valuing people that have the specific experience. Maybe they have the data scientist experience, but no climate experience, and bringing their background and their passion for the climate space to their company. So that is really great to see in my perspective.
Yeah, I think following onto the trends, I think something that's been really fantastic to see in the last handful of years is the continued commitment from the VC community to invest in climate tech. I think we've gone through some really interesting economic circumstances recently, and to really see the continued commitment, I think that climate is still at the forefront of that community's mind. So it's been really great to see that companies like Pachama, other climate companies, are being funded really well. And again, to I think Anne's point, that while we do have some really niche specific roles that I think from a recruiting perspective can make them particularly challenging to fill, as the climate community, people who are looking to pivot into the industry, that group of candidates is so significant now that there are different tangential industries and experience and skill set that we're open to hiring for, based of course on the role for sure. And then again, just the interest from an applicant perspective, I think we're seeing more and more hires from direct applicants versus in the past where we would, I think, focus a lot of our efforts on sourcing candidates. So it's been really great to see both the interest from the funding perspective, but also a candidate perspective as well. And us being amenable to different types of skill sets is something, of course, that we're still trying to strive towards. While we do have a high bar and some roles are quite technical, there are, plenty of opportunities, I think, for folks to be able to kind of break into the industry with a varying degree of skills. So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say I would echo a lot of what I've heard here. Some other things to add is that I think in addition to some of the private investment in the climate tech space, certainly the federal funding landscape is really driving a tremendous amount of growth. And also a lot of what Anne mentioned about the regionality. So a lot of what you see in terms of opportunities that are cropping up in places that previously haven't been there relates to the amount of federal investment that is trickling across all of our 50 states and will continue to do so. And so it does really change the landscape of which markets are active, and how states and municipalities that maybe in the past weren't coming to the table are so now looking to match some of those federal funds and looking to really generate growth in the sector. And then the other thing that more on a micro level that I see when I talk to employers is really them starting to think about the need to look differently at how they hire and support. And I heard a little bit of this as well. We hear a lot more from employers that understand really having to identify those core transferable skills in their candidates and think about what they can do in terms of in-house upskilling, whether it be on the job training or mentoring, and also how they can connect with their local community colleges and public colleges to try and generate additional training programs that can sit alongside their recruitment efforts. So I think that there really is a level of interconnectivity that's starting to happen in a lot of these spaces that's exciting and that lends to more opportunity for more candidates.
Absolutely. And a lot here that we want to unpack, and I definitely want to come back to. But maybe on this kind of broad view, climate tech, when we say climate tech, that can encompass so many different things, right? There's everything from like small startups working on pilot or demonstration projects, all the way through massive solar companies and wind that are very well established and global and huge. So in terms of the trends that you just talked about, what kinds of companies do you see growing the most and hiring the most at this moment?
I actually have a blurb to read, because just yesterday, Evan, who's the CEO of Climatebase, and I, he pulled up some data for something else we were doing. So I said, oh, great, I can bring it to this. And this is by no means the only companies, but right now, in the last 2 months, what we've seen, jobs posted, most from companies, battery companies, robotics, EVs, they continue to grow completely. And then EV charging solutions, there's a lot more EV charging solutions out in the market now and more being developed. And then hydrogen. And that's, I'll let others speak to the nonprofit. There's tons of nonprofit and wind and whatnot. But in the past couple of months, those were the largest percentage of jobs that we saw posted on the Climatebase job board.
Wow.
Yeah, I think hardware companies are certainly going to be or have a higher propensity to hire the most right now. And I think specifically to some of the sectors that Anne was mentioning, I think when you get to smaller climate tech companies, there are what you will find kind of on the opposite side is that there are some smaller tech companies that can be maybe slightly risk averse. And I think evaluating the economic landscape has force them to scale their hiring back a little bit. So I think most of the more in demand, like the companies that are going to be hiring the most will likely be, I think, in the hardware, or I'd also say potentially in the consulting industry as well. So any of the larger consulting firms, I think they're always looking for people with sustainability backgrounds, people who are, I think from a consultative perspective, we hire a lot of roles that are very heavily consultative. So I would say that those larger firms, but again, I think hardware is probably going to be one of the more, one of the larger industries that's hiring, probably higher volume.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting as we see climate tech shift from being in a phase of really sort of early generation of ideas and technologies to mass deployment. You see that trend of those jobs really expanding in the installation space across all of those different industries. And a lot of the ones that Anne mentioned are on, cycle to in the next decade or so double in size or even faster. So you see those really dramatic growths in the newer technologies. And again, some of the growth is, still to be seen. I know we're waiting on huge hydrogen hub proposal announcements from the federal government that are really going to result in a massive amount of potential deployment across the states and consortia that get those grants. So lots of continued opportunity and growth.
And then maybe on the flip side of that, or additionally to that, beyond companies, what types of roles do you see growing the most? What are the skills that really are the most in demand right now that you see kind of being posted over and over again or being prioritized as these job postings become available?
Do you want me to go first, or does someone else want to jump in?
Please.
Okay. So data scientist and analytics, those are just super hard to find candidates for. And a lot of companies are hiring, and machine learning engineers. And then software engineers, and to Jamie's point about the hardware companies, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, lab technicians. And most hardware companies that I'm aware of will hire people without industry experience, without climate, that are interested. So if you are a mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, a lab manager, a lab tech, a CNC operator, you have a tremendous opportunity to join climate companies, specifically in the hardware space. And then a lot of operations as well. And I know operations is a lot of different types of roles, but that's another kind of booming area of jobs out there.
Yeah, definitely on the technical side. Most of the roles that are in demand are probably going to be highly technical, and mentioning machine learning engineers, that's one of the more challenging roles that we actually look at filling. It looks different for every company. For Pachama, we look for forestry and geospatial experience. I think geospatial is is something that specifically for, again, our company is something that's quite specific to fill. What else? Yeah, the engineering roles, any applied science. We do a lot of forest carbon project development. So having individuals who are well versed in the carbon market, I think that carbon experience actually translates across a lot of different climate tech companies. And having that experience, associated carbon methodologies, those are, the carbon market, while it's still evolving, I think that's a really great foundational set of skills that we look for in a lot of our roles across our organization. So yeah, you get into things like strategy and operations, or also some of our more in-demand positions. But I'd say all of that kind of ties back into technical, really being those are the most in-demand positions for sure.
We certainly see similar trends. I think a lot of the positions that have been mentioned are certainly the ones that employers indicate are the absolute hardest to find. That said, there's also growing opportunity for more entry-level positions that may be able to be accessed without a traditional four-year degree. Those also are technical in nature, often aligned with skills trades positions. So for folks who might be inclined to really impact climate through hands-on work and through on-the-job training, there's a lot of opportunities in the installation, repair, and maintenance segment of the sphere. Those aren't usually the jobs that folks go the recruiter route on, but they are jobs that if you're thinking about trying to have fast-paced entry to, there's a lot of alternatives there.
Absolutely. And just so our viewers know, I think you're already using this function, but you can go into the Q&A bar and upvote any questions, which is super helpful so that we know which ones to prioritize. And on that note, Jennifer, there's a question here about entry-level work. Naomi here is saying that there seems to be a little bit of a gap between what is being taught in schools and that curriculum and how it translates into what folks are hiring for. So maybe if you can see what you can talk a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of those super entry level out of college jobs, and maybe how can people stand out in a job search of that kind. And anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start. It's definitely something that we see. And I would say that this is not just about the job seeker, it's also a little bit about the employers. So one conversation that we frequently have is with employers is about what they consider their entry-level jobs. And sometimes what they categorize as entry-level still does require a fair bit of skills that are hard to get outside of if you've been in the market. And so that's a conversation that we continually have with employer partners. One thing I would say is that when we ask employer partners to look at what they've level set it against in terms of who they hired versus what the job description said, especially in that entry level space, we find that they report having made a fair bit of caveats and doing a lot of on the job training. So a lot of times it might be 6 out of 10 of the things they were asking for that they wind up getting. So I'd say the biggest thing is to not be discouraged if you don't have all of the pieces, and to also be looking at what skills you have that and transfer. But we see a lot of those entry-level technician spaces, some of the more entry-level project management roles. There is an opportunity to come in without ticking all the boxes. And whatever you can do to show that you're making moves towards the industry, whether it's a short-term internship, volunteer work, research that you're doing as part of coursework, all those things can help, especially when employers are having to make calls to hire people that don't have everything. They can at least see someone has a solid intent to be in the space, and that can make a big difference.
Yeah, I think those are all really great points, and something that we're probably going to get into here a little bit later. But there are, just outside of whatever your curriculum was in your education program, but you can also pursue other trainings and certifications that climate specific organizations will offer. So, and cohorts as well. So you can do trainings by 1.5 as a really great resource for folks who want to do, a little bit of a shorter certification course just to get the exposure to climate and different types of requirements that roles might be looking for. But there's also, and as Anne's probably going to speak to a little bit more, but joining networks like Climatebase and really creating or just being more a part of the broader network that's looking for, a pivot into the space. And I think joining smaller think tanks and, there's really a lot of things I think you can kind of do outside your education, but it is true. There aren't a lot of programs that really are applicable to moving directly into the climate space right after college, for sure.
I would 100% agree with that. And luckily, seems like the trend is starting, but it's not as far as it should be. So if you're looking for an entry-level position and would be speaking to people who are still in college or know people that are, I would say, like Jamie said, network like crazy. A lot of the climate companies are advertising their internship positions on Handshake. So definitely get your resume on there. There's sustainability minors now that I think is an awesome minor. And I love seeing that on resumes. And even if you have to take extra classes because, if you're a business major, if you're a computer science major, and it's going to be a few extra credits and you have to take 18 credits instead of 15, I say do it, because it's going to go a long way to have that on your resume and just to have that experience. And a lot of companies, especially the smaller and startups, are hiring interns between freshman and sophomore year, where historically everyone does their internship between sophomore and junior year with the hopes of getting hired on. So if you could do internships at 2 or 3 different companies, you're probably going to have a really good chance of getting hired by one of them or getting offers from all of them if you do a good job. So start networking as early as possible if you're interested in the space.
For sure. And then we have some questions here around education as well, right? So if somebody is still in college, I think, Anne, you talked a little bit about that, but also Patrick is asking, in what instances is it recommended or even necessary to pursue a graduate degree? What kind of roles is that advisable for? Or what would you say to someone who maybe has completed their 4-year education and is weighing whether or not an additional degree is necessary to enter the field versus when maybe that's not necessary or maybe not such a great idea?
I think Jamie might be able to answer that question because it seems like your positions are highly technical. So maybe if you want to start.
Yeah, I say, again, it depends on the role, right? I don't think it's necessary that you have necessarily a master's or a PhD if it's a non-technical role. I think that's when you can start looking into different certifications and programs and networking that will be a little bit different and hopefully manifest some of the experience that you're looking for that would be applicable for some of those positions. Now, for technical roles, for applied science and engineering positions, we typically look for a master's, if not, in some of our more senior science positions, we do have quite a few PhDs on our staff. So it depends on, again, what the role is. I'd say that not every role is going to require the additional years of education, but again, it really depends. But mostly for technical roles, you probably are looking at, a master's plus, depending on the seniority of the level as well. So, yeah.
Sometimes that's hard to get around because they want that. But then there also are companies too that will pay for education. So keep that in mind. So maybe you're not going to get your dream job, but you'll get in with a company and maybe start on the software engineering team instead of the machine learning team, gain experience with the company, prove yourself. They'll pay for your education. You get your master's, then you can move over to the team that you really want to be on. So that's also an option. PhD obviously is a whole different story because it's years, but you're also working while you're getting your PhD. So once you graduate, not only do you have your education, but you also instantly have work experience because you're doing lab research. You're working. So if you're a PhD right now, it's probably nothing's easy, but it's probably easier to get a position than someone that just requires a bachelor's or a master's because you've already done so much work in your program.
And internships are a wonderful opportunity to get your foot in the door, and those will oftentimes turn into full-time opportunities. And again, I think always be looking at companies who have the benefits that tie into continuing education. Pachama has a stipend for continuing education, a yearly stipend. So those are things you obviously want to, if you're interested in continuing, something that you should definitely prioritize when you're looking into companies, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like you guys have covered it really well. The only other thing I'd say is that, echoing that piece about internships is really important. We run a decade-old internship program, and one of the biggest things that we see is also the importance of that really helping people figure out and navigate what the right fit is for them, because it's such a such a broad industry or sector. Actually, really, it's a movement that crosses multiple industries if we're going to get technical. And so for folks to figure out where to position themselves, that's really helpful. And one thing that we find is that especially people that do multiple internships find out that where they originally thought they wanted to be situated in the space is oftentimes not the case. And that can help them make more strategic decisions about that next step, whether or not it really makes sense to pursue a master's or PhD, if they can have real clarity of exactly where they want to be in the space, because the answers are so different depending on the role and the sector.
For sure. There's also a big movement, shall we say, of people not entry level, but further along in their careers wanting to make the jump over to climate tech. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what you're seeing there from maybe mid-career to like further along in their careers. What are maybe trends or things that you've seen recently? Where are people coming from, and what are they looking for when they say, I want to move into climate tech?
So I think from a recruiter's point of view, if I'm always open to listening to the candidate, why do you want to be here? Why do you want to work at this company? And if they have a compelling story, I can tell they're passionate, that's going to be a great employee, assuming they're qualified. So let's talk about the EV space. There's, more and more EV, not just cars, but buses, scooters, all across the board. Well, people that work in the automobile manufacturing, if you're a mechanical engineer, electrical engineer, work in the lab, those are great candidates to bring on because they already have the automotive background, but they haven't worked in climate. And they're going to typically be, I hate to bundle people, but so appreciative that you hired them in this space. That's going to be the employee that you're probably going to retain because they want to be part of growth of a company, and they haven't been at 2 or 3 startups in the past. They've just crossed the line. So I always tell them, companies, employers, don't rule out people that don't have climate experience, because some of your best employees, if they have the right qualifications and skills, are going to be people that have not worked in climate that want to move in climate. And listen to them. If someone says to me, I haven't worked in climate, but I have solar panels on my roof and I put them on myself. I can do electrical work, if you're going to hardware company. Well, that's someone that's obviously passionate about electrification space and they want to get into climate. They're going to be so happy and they're going to give it 110, 120% once you hire them.
Yeah, I think that folks who are a little bit further into their careers, again, like everybody pivots for some reason. And we're always looking for, what's the incentive? What's the driving force that's has them interested in climate? I always love to see applications that include like a why Pachama. And it really makes applications stand out. It gives more context to the resume. Or to the application. It's always, again, we've so many inbounds, and to really set yourself apart, I think it's great to, create a little bit more of a personalized message as to why are you passionate about climate, and really tying it back to a personal experience. We're seeing so many applicants coming now from big tech, where before, I don't know, as a smaller company, you would necessarily see that. But people are becoming more and more incentivized to work on our most challenging problem, which is fighting climate change. And so we've seen so many candidates who are even willing to take, and for whatever reason, they're willing to take a pay cut to join companies that have maybe smaller salary ranges. But climate is starting to affect so many different demographics. And so when you find somebody from a larger company, which we do find more often today, and maybe they don't have the applicable, necessarily direct experience that we're looking for, it's just really interesting to see how somebody ties a personal story to what their motivation is to join climate. And so we never, it's been a bit interesting, but I would say that, we're always open to anybody who's making that pivot, regardless of if they have that direct experience or not.
Yeah, I think one tool that I would add to all this, and I feel like it's one of the most underutilized things, is informational interviews. So for folks that aren't familiar with that, that's when you reach out to a company or to someone at a company just to try and, understand more about the company and the work. And it isn't part of a hiring process. It's outside of it. And a lot of places will say yes. A lot of folks will agree to do those. They're often really short, 15 to 20 minutes. But for mid-career professionals that are trying to transition, getting that kind of conversation on board with a few different companies is a way to help them very quickly understand, what they might want to consider as they try and market themselves and as they transition. And sometimes in that conversation, you get really good advice too about what the right entry point might be based on your previous skill set. So it doesn't hurt to ask for those. You won't always get a yes, but in my experience, if you reach out to 5 people, at least one of them will give you an informational interview and you'll wind up really ahead of the game.
I think that's great advice. One of the things that we hear a lot from, so for those unfamiliar, we have a column called Charging Up, and that is bi-weekly. There's a ton of great advice, so I definitely recommend people check that out as well. But one of the things I hear over and over again is that there's this misconception that the only thing that will get you into climate tech is highly technical experience or degrees. And I know that we talked about how those maybe are the roles in most demand, but on the flip side of that, what is some advice for people with non-technical backgrounds and non-technical expertise to where do they start? And maybe what are some of the roles that are growing in the space for someone who does not, in fact, have a technical background?
Yeah, again, I think we've mentioned some of these resources, but joining climate networks like Climatebase or Terra.do, Work on Climate is a fantastic Slack group where I actually recruit from that Slack group specifically. It's a wonderful community. You don't have to be technical to start networking, to start going and getting your trainings through 1.5 or any exposure you can get to climate tech. Some of the roles that you want to look for are going to be maybe operational roles where you can actually be a little bit more project focused rather than having to be highly technical like an engineer or a scientist. Analyst, like junior level, like entry level analyst positions can be a little bit more data centric, but it doesn't need to be super strategic. You can get into more project management, I think is a wonderful probably opportunity that you don't have to be highly technical for. But yeah, I think that, again, using some of those resources to get the exposure to other people who are looking for roles in climate, to be more a part of the conversation about what's happening in the climate space, educating yourself, but also, going for some of those more, I think, less technical roles is certainly something that is probably a good entry point for sure.
I agree 100% with that too. And Work on Climate is awesome. Posting jobs, and if you do that, join as many of the channels as possible, because there's just some people will put themselves out there. Like I saw one this morning, I have 15 years of experience doing what they're doing. I haven't worked in climate, but I really want to. I'm passionate, and just wrote a little blurb about themselves. So hopefully a recruiter will see that and call them. So, there's a lot of jobs that are non-technical, but those, aren't going to get filled by technical people. But if you're an accountant, if you're in the finance space, like Jamie said, project management, product managers, most companies in the climate space will definitely look at people without climate experience. So if you're looking for those roles, I think you're going to have an easier time getting hired by climate. But if you are highly technical, as Jamie said, network like crazy. Don't just randomly send a LinkedIn message to everyone at the company, because then they all talk and they're like, wait, why is this person doing that? But go on there, see if you have any connections to anyone, and ask for an introduction. Ask for a virtual coffee and just say, can I take 20 minutes of your time? Send them a $5 Starbucks gift card and say, buy a coffee if you want. And then hopefully they can introduce you to someone at the company, the hiring manager, the in-house recruiter or whatnot, and do it in a professional way. To get your foot in the door is always good advice as well.
Yeah, I would say the other thing is that so many communities right now are having to do public stakeholder outreach around their climate plans, whether it be at the municipality level or regional or state. And so that isn't a place where you go to get a job, but it is a place where there's networking opportunities that are open to everyone. So, right now we're sort of actively all deciding, how we're going to pursue climate plans, and there's always a stakeholder piece to that. So looking at what's going on right in your own backyard and what's happening in your community is a way to get hooked into understanding and to meeting the right set of folks to figure out, how do you get into the industry, and also, who else can potentially be maybe an informal mentor or something like that.
I think that is super important. We have a ton of questions about like very specific actionable things. So maybe we can get a little bit into that. You all spend a lot of time looking at resumes and cover letters and applications. And so I'd love to hear maybe a little bit about what are some great practices, what is something that everyone should be doing, and what are maybe some pitfalls to avoid falling into when you're putting together your application for a role that you're very excited about.
Make sure that your resume is one page and as succinct as possible. I think recruiters spend maybe between, a few seconds really glancing over, resumes and determining if that person if that application is qualified or not. It's really important to highlight your most applicable experience or education at the very top of your resume. So be as succinct as possible. I would avoid applying to multiple positions at the same time. Make sure that you're being really thoughtful. I know that it's easy to be really excited about an organization and want to just apply to all positions and just kind of see where best fit might be, but really take some time to read through a job description and decide if you don't have to check all the boxes, but maybe just decide which one is really the best aligned with your experience. And again, when you're applying, I think it's always really thoughtful, or it's eye-catching for a recruiter internally or wherever, but to add a little context as to what's driving you to move into climate, what has you excited about applying to X company. And then again, I think sending a personalized message, being very careful about how broad you cast your net. You don't want to message, again, as Ann said, you don't want to message multiple people in an organization, but be thoughtful about the job you're applying for. Who is on that team at that company? Maybe message one person and ask them for a little bit of an introduction or an overview. Reach out to the recruiter with a short message, and I think, again, you don't need to keep applying for the same position over and over again. But a quick follow-up with the recruiter is something that I think is also can be appreciated. But again, just I think be careful about your cadence and how often you reach out, how many times you apply, and the number of roles that you apply to, and just make sure that resume is concise. but that's
Yeah, if you apply to the same position on LinkedIn and Indeed in the company's website, it all goes to the same place. And we, the recruiter, we're going to get it 3 times and say, why did this person apply to the same job 3 times? So be thoughtful. And in addition to one page, I know Jamie talked about cover letter, change your cover letter for each job you apply to, because we, the recruiter or the hiring manager, whoever is reading it, wants to hear from you why you're excited about the role and company. And maybe if there's 3 roles that you're a potential fit for, but not a perfect fit for any of them, apply to one. And on your cover letter, say, I know I'm not an exact fit for this position. I noticed position A, B, and C. I'd be interested in speaking with you about any of these. If you feel I'm a potential fit, I would love to jump on a call. Just make the recruiter aware that you're not 100% fit, but you're so interested in the company. And then another tip is, and most candidates do this, but there's some that don't, always have a link to your LinkedIn profile on your resume, because we always go to your LinkedIn profile. And so make sure your LinkedIn profile is consistent with your resume. Because if we see you work at company A from May 2022 to January 2023, and then there's nothing else on your resume, but we go to your LinkedIn profile and you are working somewhere else, February 2023 to present, it's like if you didn't take the time to update your resume, that just shows that the person's work, they're not work ethic, but you may not be the streamlined person that we're looking for. So just make sure LinkedIn and resumes are consistent, and always have the link to your LinkedIn profile hyperlinked on your resume. So it's easy for recruiters and hiring managers, whoever reads your resume can click on there to get to LinkedIn.
Yeah, those are all great tips. One thing that we've been sort of hearing some fatigue from employers that participate in our internship program is AI generated cover letters. And so while I think that's great, sometimes if you've got writer's block and you hop on an AI tool to get started, you can't let it finish there because they're very generic, and folks are getting stuck sometimes seeing almost the same verbiage in multiple applicants, and it just makes it hard for people want to invest. So everything that everyone said in terms of, really making sure that it's personalized to the company, to the job that you're applying for, and that you don't lose your own personal voice. Even if, I think we can all be self-critical, but there's value in authenticity. So I just encourage people to go back to that before you submit.
I think that's a great shout. It can be really tough going through a process of application. And so, of course, I understand where that drive comes from, but it is good to know that it is being noticed. It's not like people don't know that these tools are out there. We have some questions about this, and I'd also love to get into a little bit the culture. What are some things that you all think makes climate tech or working in climate unique to other industries, and what is part of the culture? We had a question around like remote first work, which big tech has really been prioritizing over the past 2 years. Is that something that you see also tracks in climate tech, or how is it different?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, we're a fully remote company. We really prioritize a work-life balance. I think a majority of candidates are still looking for remote. But again, maybe potentially with an interest to meet in person a few times a year. I don't know how in-person work is going to be a long-term interest for many of the people that I speak with in my experience, but it's because work-life balance, I think in the adversity that we've all faced in the last 2 to 3 years, I think work-life balance has become increasingly important. One of the things that I think really sets climate tech companies apart from other types of organizations, and I talk about this a lot with my candidates, but you have the ability to contribute your skills to direct impact. The work here at the company at Pachama, most of our work efforts manifest in reforestation projects that actually, mitigate climate change and promote biodiversity and support communities in those areas where those forests exist. And so the ability to make and actually see the direct impact of your work is really invaluable. And when I talk a lot about culture with my candidates, climate is just most people who are either currently in or looking to get in have a deep commitment to the climate mission. And I think that really fosters a greater sense of collaboration. For many people, it's really the most important work that people will do in their lives. And there's a great sense of urgency that I think a lot of people feel, which drives individuals to really create excellent and high integrity work. And one thing that I really highlight for candidates too, that's a differentiator, is there's a huge sense of empathy in I think just climate tech work generally, just because of the nature of our work. And so I think that oftentimes those qualities can really appeal to people that are looking to make that transition. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, if not 100%, climate companies do have a great culture. CEOs of climate companies, for the most part, seem to be very hands-on. So it makes an employee feel really good when they get to be in a conference room with the CEO. At a large company, and even non-large companies that aren't climate, it's probably rare that you're going to be able to sit in a conference room with the CEO or have town hall once a month or have lunch with the CEO and an executive team on Fridays. And a lot of whether it's virtual or in person, offer that. And I think it just empowers people to really be themselves and bring their voice and not be afraid to speak up, which really makes a collaborative culture. And then they're proud to be part of a team that is building a product or has a service, and they can see it through from start or from when they join the company to the end. And it just makes people feel really good about themselves. And I think they work harder. And I think the work remote for the majority of the companies, climate allows that, which people like. Now on the flip side with hardware companies, most have to be in office, and there's people that definitely love being in office and have missed being in office. So when they get to be in the lab, when they get to touch the product, when they get to actually see a panel or a charging station on the wall and work on it daily, that's something that you get as well. So if there are people that are looking to work in an office collaboratively with people, I would highly recommend looking at hardware companies, because even if you're a software engineer, you can have the option of working in the office or working remotely or working hybrid. So it gives people a really strong sense of connection if that's something, there are people that definitely want to be physically with people. And then there's those that love being remote. And then there's the mix. So I think a lot of the climate companies offer both of those, depending what type of role you get.
I think you guys have covered a lot of it when it comes to remote versus in person or hybrid. The one other thing that I would add just on company culture is also, I think that just because of the nature of, climate work and where it comes from, there is even a different and a greater attention to issues of diversity and inclusion often in these companies, because really for them to have gotten into this, there's usually an investment in trying to improve communities, and not just one segment of the community. And so that trickles into leadership and how they hire. And so there's an opportunity really to look at that as part of the culture and part of the package. And I think most climate companies are further along in thinking about that than maybe in some other spaces. And so that's really refreshing, and they may value your input on that as well.
Jennifer, thank you so much for bringing that in. That was going to be my next question, because we have some questions in the chat asking, how do you see climate companies prioritizing diversity in their hiring process? So maybe, I don't know if Jamie or Anne, you want to expand on that, but also how does the industry fare? What are some challenges that are still pervasive when it comes to gender and racial diversity in these companies as they scale?
Yeah, as an organization, we specifically want to be very thoughtful about our DEI practices. I think it's really, you have to do it right. And for us, from like a candidate perspective, for every 2 non-diverse candidates, we need to ensure that there's a diverse candidate at the same stage in the process to ensure that we are putting the most diverse set of candidates forward. I think one of the things that we do struggle with today, and things that we have to be really careful about, are the amount of inbounds. The applicants that we get for any given role is anywhere between 250 and 500 applicants a day for a position. And so in the last few years, because of the application volume, recruiting focus has shifted from sourcing to application review. And sourcing is still so critical to ensure that you are diversifying your pipeline. I think that's something that from a recruiting perspective, we have to be really careful about. And that's something that we ensure that we're integrating as part of our process to make sure that we are continuing to diversify our workforce as much as possible.
Yeah, I agree with exactly what Jamie said. And if you're going to would be talking to an employee rather than candidates, but if a company is going to put a plan out there, DE&I, they need to follow it, because words don't mean anything unless they actually take action on them. So find different ways to find diverse candidates if you need to level out a team. And there's some great organizations out there. For instance, one that I have used, because let's face it, software engineers, there's more and more females getting software engineering degrees, but historically it's been males. And so there's an organization called Lesbians Who Tech, and it's for anyone can join it, but there's great diversity candidates there, and it's a great place to post jobs to get diversity. And then there's a lot of other diversity sites as well, and give a fair chance to everyone. And don't, companies aren't going to hire just to fill a bucket, because that doesn't serve purpose for the company, and then it sets the candidate up to fail if you hire someone when they're not qualified. But just being sourcing is key. And one of the biggest problems all recruiters have is time. So if you're looking at if you have 10 job openings and you're getting 300 applicants a day, that's 3,000 applicants a day. And one recruiter, there's not enough time in the day to look at them, but we make the time. So we have to be thoughtful from our end too on who we're bringing in, and listen to our hiring managers, listen to the CEO, and then find ways to fill positions and level out teams as needed with quality candidates.
And I think from a candidate perspective, just some advice, right? Like there are groups that you can join that are specific to like women in GIS. There are jobs posted on inhersite.com is really great. There are diversity job boards that you just want to make sure that you pay attention to. Diversity.com. I mean, there's so many different resources that companies will hopefully be utilizing to reflect their commitment to DEI initiatives. So definitely, keep an eye on that. I think there's some really wonderful resources out there. And then if you see that a company has populated their positions on those specific job boards, I think that's a good indicator to understand what the values of the company are, make sure they're in alignment with who you are, what sort of company that you want to be a part of. So
I think that's great perspective to keep in mind, is that like hiring processes and applying for these jobs are also like a two-way street. And applicants also want to make sure that this is a place where they actually want to work and would enjoy their time, rather than just wanting a job kind of at all costs. And I think that's just good perspective to keep in mind for folks that are going through it now. And again, it can be an overwhelming process. Let's talk about compensation. So it's something that obviously it's going to vary widely across the country. There's companies that are like localized, there's companies that are not, but maybe we can give more of like an expectation setting. Jamie, you were saying before that a lot of people are willing to take a pay cut, but how is the industry faring relative to other equivalent kind of job positions? And then what should a candidate be doing? Should they be looking for? How do you advise they go through kind of doing their research and setting expectations for comp?
Yeah, I mean, compensation is determined differently based on the company size, just across the board. So for example, Pachama, we compensate US positions are compensated based on the San Francisco market because we do still need to maintain a competitiveness, but our benchmarks are comparative against companies of our size. So that's in relation to our valuation. So you always want to keep in mind is how large is this company? What is their recent valuation? That will help to give you an idea of what the compensation for a certain position is. And then of course, for like international employees, we do a location-based pay. But we do also follow, which you'll see for a lot of different companies as well, but we follow pay transparency laws, and we will post our salary bands on our website for each position. So we like to provide that transparency as much as possible. If, for example, you apply for a position, you go through the interview process, and maybe you're a little bit more of a junior candidate than to what we had scoped the original role to be. We'll have that pretty transparent conversation with you that, hey, we'd love to bring you in at a little bit of a different level than what we've posted. We'll always work with you through the process to help you understand how we benchmark our salaries and how that relates to what your experience and impact will ultimately be. But again, it's going to vary from company to company. Compensation practices are wildly different. Data is pulled from different data sources, so that's also going to impact what the salary is at a particular company. But just as like in your job search, I think Glassdoor is a fantastic resource to use. You can look up a certain company, or you can look up a specific role. You can see what the range is, and it'll give you a much better idea of what you're looking at when you're considering a certain company or an opportunity. So it's a great tool to use as you're doing that research. So,
and also I think candidates need to look at the whole package, because compensation is not just salary. So equity is so different at different companies. So, this is getting a little bit high level, but company A, they may give you 1,000 shares of equity, and company B may give you 2,000, and like, I want to go with company B because it's more equity, but the strike price could be $1 at company A and it could be $10 at company B. So if you look at it that way, company A is giving you a lot more value in the equity. And then the insurance, do they cover 100% of health insurance or do they cover half? Do they give you tuition reimbursement? Do you get a gym membership? You have to look at everything, and recruiters are always like an open book about talking to you about that. So don't be shy, even upfront before an interview, asking what a total comp package looks. I mean, they're not going to give you the exact salary because you need to interview to see the level you come in, but recruiters will talk to you about the full benefits and the total comp. And then keep that in mind if you have 2 or 3 different offers on what obviously what company you feel best working for, but also compensation, obviously, if you're comparing them, what the total package is, not the salary figure.
These are all great tips, especially, in the private sector. I would say in public or nonprofit, you have a whole different set of data sources you can look to. So nonprofit companies have to post their 990s. Oftentimes you won't find the most recent year, but you'll find one that's a few years out. It's not going to have every employee's salary on it, but it will have their executive salaries, and that gives you a good sense of leveling. In terms of public positions, most states you have to post their whole public payroll. So it's just a matter of identifying the state database. And that also can be a good place to look for jobs if you're transitioning in. A lot of times, even if you ultimately want to wind up in the private sector, the public sector is interfacing heavily with the private sector in this industry. And we find that many of the folks that start out in public sector are able to transition to those private sector jobs because they've built all the relationships in a very short time. So it's worth looking at those positions as well, not only for benchmarks, but for opportunities.
For sure. So we are coming at an end of our hour, which is crazy because I feel like I could talk to the 3 of you for hours. But maybe to wrap it up with, I'd love to hear a quick piece of advice that you would leave someone going through this process, someone who's maybe excited, maybe overwhelmed, maybe just in the thick of the application process. What's your advice to them?
Don't get frustrated. There's so many applicants. It can really feel defeating when you apply yourself to so many different organizations and receive rejection letters. And I think it's just really important to be persistent and thoughtful in your approach. Again, I think a direct message will go a long way, some context to your application. But yeah, don't get discouraged. It's competitive. But again, I think, keep at it, and it's just,
Be patient. You have to be patient. Sure. The right job will come along, and it'll, sometimes great things are worth waiting for. So be patient, network like crazy. I mean, networking is going to really help you get into some companies. And then once again, the 1-page resume, the really good LinkedIn profile, just make sure before you even start your job search, or if you're in the middle of it, that things are aligned and that it's talking about you. We want to hear the real you, your skills, obviously, but also who you are and why we would want you to join our company and how you would fit in. So don't be afraid to ask for help from anyone or have people review your resume. It's, sometimes 4 eyes are better than 2.
I agree with everything that's said. The one other thing I would add is don't underestimate the power of the thank you email after the interview. And don't look at it as just being polite. Look at it as a way to show people how you synthesize information, what you remembered they said and what matters. And to summarize some of the things that you really want to leave them with, because if you're getting an interview, you've crossed probably the biggest hurdle from the pipeline threshold. And it's a real way to help yourself stand out as you move from that first interview potentially to the next. So I would not underestimate that as an opportunity and as a pivot point as you're moving through the process.
Awesome. This is such great advice. As a reminder, the webinar will be recorded. And one last piece of advice I'll leave everyone with is read Canary Media. We are a free publication and a nonprofit, and it will give you great context about what is happening broadly in the space, which is great to have as you go through the interviews. But with that, thank you all so much for giving us your time, which is very precious. And thanks everyone for joining us. This has been so much fun.
Thank you.
Maria.